Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Nedgroup Investments Insights. I hope you've enjoyed them so far this month. We've heard one on leadership from Rassie Erasmus, and of course we've also had one on presentation skills from Richard Mulholland. Today we turn our attention, however, to something far more important, and that is the one of Eskom and how it has impacted and will impact the economy, our businesses, and our personal lives going forward. The topic is around what is Eskom going to do and are doing to avoid load shedding in the future. It gives me great pleasure today to welcome Andre de Ruyter, who's the Group Chief Executive of Eskom. He has been at the helm since January this year, as well as Nicky Weimar, who is the Nedbank Chief Economist. They will be in conversation today to discuss this topic after Andre has given a presentation. Please note that you are able to ask questions, just type them in. We will be following them, and Nikki will do her best to address those questions when it comes to Q&A time with Andre. So with that as my introduction, thank you very much, and over to you, Nikki.
Absolute pleasure. I just wanted to welcome you all, one and all, very welcome to this seminar, which is really addressing probably one of the most important issues in the South African economy. It has been a problem for South Africa for an extended period of time. It is probably the most pressing economic constraint we are facing. Not only has it influenced our past economic performance, but it is likely to have a very enormous bearing on our future economic performance. And what I'm of course talking about is the lack of really reliable and cost-effective electricity. What we have seen over the last couple of years is that the lack of reliable and cost-effective electricity is really what slowly and surely been a key contributor to the fact that we have slowly and surely lost economic momentum, and it was a big trigger in pushing us into recession in the second half of last year, and it was probably the key factor behind a very poor mining and manufacturing performance in the first quarter, which really just helped the recession settle in very nicely and contributed to this economy contracting by 2% on a quarter-on-quarter basis. And that was only up until the first quarter. Then COVID-19 struck, then the most bizarrely strict lockdown in the world was imposed in South Africa. Under level 5 lockdown, almost all economic activity grinded to a halt, except for the bare essentials. And that 1 month, April, did an enormous amount of damage to the South African economy. We now know, as we look at all the monthly indicators from mining, manufacturing, to building plans passed and completed, all the way through to retail sales and wholesale sales, and even to credit activity out there, that the economy is in serious trouble. The Reuters consensus forecast for second quarter GDP is that the economy probably contracted by over 40% quarter-on-quarter annualized. Our own forecast is that contraction will probably be closer to 48% quarter-on-quarter annualized, and that we are entering a very, very tough period for South Africa indeed, and for the year as a whole. We are looking probably at a contraction of between 8% and 10% in GDP. And I think for many South Africans, it was an enormous surprise to find that in the midst of such economic disaster, where undoubtedly demand collapsed, that we were still having to deal with load shedding and power outages. And not just at stage 1, but in fact at stage 2. And here to shed light on this mystery for all of us is none other than the CEO of Eskom. And I am very interested in what he has to say, and I'm sure all of our clients are equally anxious to hear what Mr. de Ruyter has to say to us today. And he is going to shed some light, hopefully, for us on why, even in the midst of an economy contracting by over 40% on a quarter-on-quarter basis, do we still have power outages, and what is Eskom doing to address this what has become almost a frequent part of our lives, load shedding, makes it very difficult for businesses to plan going forward. And hopefully we'll get some answers today. And with that, over to you, Andre.
Thank you very much, Nicky, and thanks for setting the scene so clearly. I think shedding light is probably the operative phrase to apply to any presentation on Eskom, because that's what we aim to achieve. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the measures that we've taken to address some of our known shortcomings, some of our strategic focus areas going forward, and then subsequently what we see the future is going to hold for us from an energy perspective. And I think it's a bright and exciting future if we play our cards right. More about that later on. So let's move on to the next slide. There we go. So it's no secret that we face a very challenging future, and it's challenging because of where we've come from. We've got enormous debt, some 480 billion, to the point where this has become part of the structural challenges that the fiscus faces. We're unable to service our debt from our own EBITDA, and we must therefore borrow to service debt. And as all of the bankers on the call will tell you today, that's not a good idea. We've seen volume declining, and this is not in small part due to the fact that our economy has been under pressure. This is, from a revenue perspective, compounded by the fact that our tariffs are not cost reflective. Now, this is a common narrative out there that South African electricity is among the most expensive in the world, and exactly the opposite is true. We have some of the cheapest electricity in the world, and we're happy to share some of the data around that. And then, of course, we've got a number of customers that don't pay us. Outstanding municipal debt at this point in time is north of 30 billion, and then we've got the Soweto debt as well, which is on its way to 9 billion rand by now. Our costs are a known problem, and this is due to the fact that prior to 2020, we saw very significant increases in employees. In our headcount, we also saw coal costs increasing, and we have a very good idea that we are paying too much for what we buy. Our energy availability factor, or EAF, is very low. It's 65%. That is unacceptably low, and that is something that we need to work on to address within the constraints of our current generation system. Now, this has all led to increasing load shedding, and if you run a business and you're trying to sell your product and you have to shed your customers because you can't manufacture what they want, that's generally a bad idea. And that has led to lost revenue. In addition, because of our power stations that were constructed in a rather more carefree age when it comes to environmental impact, we have significant challenges from an emissions perspective. So the well-known story around a death spiral, I think that's now commonly accepted, is due to the fact really that we have reached the end of the road for the vertically integrated monolithic Eskom model. We have over the years been very successful, but we are now at a point where, due to some significant changes in the energy landscape, we are required to move to a different business model. Now, in addition to all of these challenges, I think Nicky referred to some of these in her introduction, we also had some very telling challenges in the beginning of the year, first quarter. So like any good corporate, we've got a risk register containing 11 critical risks, and there they are on the screen. And we saw 4 of those risks manifest themselves. So we saw severe supply constraint due to the fact that we had the ingress of marine life into a unit at Koeberg. that led to the imposition of stage 4 load shedding. We had a catastrophic IT system failure from which we had to recover, so that impacted us very negatively. Then, of course, we have the pandemic. And then lastly, we are facing the challenges of climate change and also environmental compliance. And all of these have put us in a position where the job at Eskom certainly has not been dull or without its challenges. So as an organization, we realized that we need to change. If we did nothing and we stayed as we were, we would rapidly decline, as shown by the red pathway there. We would continue to show poor governance, lack of accountability. Our staff would leave, the good staff would leave. We wouldn't be able to attract new staff. We would be unable to operate due to spiraling losses. We would need to borrow more. And our lenders are patient, and they believe in us, and they've been very supportive of us, but their patience isn't infinite. And at some point in time, we would need to pay back the loans that they've extended. And then lastly, load shedding would have become a perennial feature of the South African landscape to a much worse extent than where we were. So what have we decided to do as part of the turnaround plan? We need to drive operational stability. First of all, we are an operating business, and my first priority is therefore to fix the operations. Secondly, we need to look at the income statement. We need to look at our severely stressed balance sheet, and then we need to restructure in order to address this legacy business model of ours that is no longer fit for purpose. And then lastly, we need to take our people along with us on this journey to change. So with operational stability, we've introduced something that's called reliability maintenance, and this is intended to catch up with some of the maintenance that was deferred during the previous decade. Now, this is not a simple matter, and people think that, you know, this is something similar to taking in your car for a service, and if it was giving you a couple of hiccups before you took it, and after the services, it runs remarkably well. But power stations are very large integrated manufacturing facilities, and they require a lot of maintenance. And when you defer maintenance, you borrow from the future at an extortionate cost. And when that bill becomes due, as it now has, it takes you a very long time to catch up. So we are trying our best to avoid load shedding. This is, of course, a fine balancing act between protecting the overall national grid from a catastrophic blackout and keeping the lights on. In the past, a philosophy applied of keeping the lights on at all costs, and part of that philosophy involved deferring maintenance. So this is clearly not a sustainable strategy. We have to take units off for maintenance, and that obviously reduces the available capacity. At the end of 2018, we had barely enough coal left to run our power stations. We had some significant challenges with our coal supply stability. Our stocks were very low, and we've been able to recover over the past year to a position where we now have no power station that's not compliant with grid code when it comes to the availability of coal. So we have started to address demand side management. This is the familiar traffic light system that you see on national television, and this is very helpful to us. This is an extremely important contribution that the South African consumer can make to help us manage the stability of the system. And on a good evening, when we put up those power alerts, that's good for about 150 megawatts. So we really appreciate that support that we're getting from the general public. We're in the process of addressing our environmental issues, but this takes a lot of capital. If we need to fix all of our environmental challenges that we've got, we will need to spend over the next decade something in the order of to 60 billion This, of course, creates an enormous challenge for us from a funding perspective, because by definition, an environmental investment is not an investment on which you earn a return. But in a converse way, it also creates an opportunity for us to improve. We're buying in power. We are currently in the final throes of assessing a variety of bids, which we think will add between 100 and 180 megawatts of electricity to the grid. We have also picked up very soon after I joined that our SAP system, our ERP system, was severely neglected. And when your SAP system doesn't function properly, as any good techie will tell you, then it's very difficult to have proper governance throughout your system. So we are repairing that. We have identified projects that we need to conduct a transmission and distribution. To give you an example, our average age of transformers in distribution is north of 50 years, and certainly in the private sector that would indicate that they are due for replacement. So that's another capital item that was deferred to some extent in order to fund the expansion and the investments in our new build program at Medupi, Kusile and Ingula. So we are looking at opportunities to repurpose power stations and facilitate a just energy transition, more about that a little later. And very importantly, look at new renewable energy capacity, all the while trying to improve supply chain management. That's a discipline that's been very much neglected. We have, as a consequence, seen inventories build up at power stations from between 1.3 to 1.7 billion rand just in spares, and not always the right type of spares. So there's a big exercise on the go to try and unpack that and improve that as a cash release opportunity. And then lastly, we are developing the model of a single market operator and buyer. So you referred earlier on to supply and demand, and we have had significant impacts as a result of the global pandemic. Initially during the lockdown, the very strict lockdown, we saw 11 gigawatts reduction in demand in the mornings. So this green part of the graph here, that is the portion by which demand dropped compared to our original forecast prior to lockdown. So there you can see that in the initial stages when lockdown was very strict, we had significant reduction in demand, but over time that demand recovered to something that is now approximating normal. Where demand dips below the zero line, that is because we've had an unusually cold winter. In fact, we've had the coldest winter in a decade. So that just added to our challenges. And of course, there again, you will know that with the cold front that approached, that created various challenges for us. So we took advantage of this constraint. We conducted short-term maintenance on known issues. Now, we couldn't do the long-term maintenance. The long-term maintenance requires you to do work that takes your units out of commission by between 80 and 120 days at a time. So clearly we didn't have the opportunity to do that work in time for the lockdown, but we were able to do the short-term opportunity maintenance. We doubled the maintenance that we did, made hay while the sun shone, as it were, and generally tried to improve our maintenance significantly. However, we must point out that we have to take more units out for the long-term reliability maintenance. We are trying to schedule it in such a way that we do not create the risk of load shedding, but inevitably the more units you take out, the more there is a challenge for us to be able to keep the country supplied with electricity, because the risk increases due to the fact that we have a constrained, unreliable and unpredictable generation system because of its age. So these are our targets. That's what we want to achieve. We were well on the way to achieving 70% when the latest bout of load shedding unfortunately made that number dip. So we have made good progress in returning some of our key units to service. We are expecting Kusile Unit 2 and 3 to reach commercial operation by September and October of this year. That will add about 1,400 megawatts of generation capacity to the system. And we're also making some changes to address the design flaws that were built into both Medupi and Kusile. So ultimately, we want to restore our operational capability by being excellent at what we do. Now, again, is there risk? Yes, there is risk. To pretend that we have eliminated the risk would be a fallacy, and we therefore need to share that there is still a likelihood of load shedding going forward. So this is our conservative assumption. UCLF stands for the unplanned capacity loss factor. The green here is the planned capacity loss, which of course tells you how much maintenance we are doing. And then we have to maintain an operating reserve, which is the yellow. The yellow is the operating reserve, the reserve that is necessary to ensure that we are able to prevent this national blackout that is something that we want to avoid at all costs. And then the pinkish part here, that is where we have to burn diesel at our OCGT plants. And you can see here that there's a significant diesel consumption that we forecast on conservative assumptions for the rest of the year. The good news is, as we perform the maintenance, this dark blue sliver here starts to expand, and by the first quarter of next year, we should see a decrease in our diesel consumption, which from an operating cost perspective is good news, because we burn in the order of between 3.5 to 4 billion rands worth of diesel every year. So that's a huge cost item that we can address. If we are more successful, and this is our aspiration, then of course the picture looks better earlier on and the risk of load shedding decreases. But the one thing that I've learned about the Eskom generation system is that it keeps you humble, and that like forecasts made by economists, you need to hedge your bets and be very careful. So the design defect that I referenced earlier, we made changes to Unit 3 at Medupi. This was completed in April of this year after a 75-day outage, and virtually immediately after startup, it for the first time ever reached its full design capacity, which was very pleasing. We are still doing tests to understand if this is a sustainable fix, but we haven't delayed. We have completed Unit 6. We have completed, we're in the process of doing Unit 4 right now. Unit 2 will follow at the end of this month, and then Unit 5 by November of this year. Similar changes, because the designs are identical between Medupi and Kusile, so the challenges are the same. That's what you get when you copy and paste, is that we will start making these changes by Q1 of 2021. So more work to be done, and until such time as that is done, unfortunately, these units will not contribute what we had anticipated, and thereby increasing the risk. Now, Ingula, which is a pumped storage scheme, that also had its challenges. We were able to fix that and re-rate it from its output of 245 megawatts to reach design capacity by February of this year. So when will these units come online? You can see the 5 units at Medupi that have reached commercial operation. They're all done. Unit 1 will be ready early next year. And then, as I said, we will look forward to putting Unit 2 and 3. Both of them are already synchronized to the grid, but they are not yet in commercial operation. So they will start running at commercial levels from September and November onwards, and then the rest of the units will follow as indicated on that slide. But you can't run a business if you don't make money, and we therefore have to focus significantly on our income statement. First of all, we want to avoid load shedding. We want to make product that we can sell, and that's the motto. We've made good progress on addressing our NERSA tariff disputes, and this is an essential part of ensuring that Eskom can be self-sustaining. We are unfortunately in a position where we have to ensure that we can implement these tariff increases in a way that does not disrupt the national economy, and we are in consultation with our shareholder in order to achieve that. Very often the point is made or the question is asked, so why don't you cut costs and then avoid the impact of these tariff increases? And we've done the math, and even if we retrench all of our staff, so we let all 44,000 employees go, we still don't save enough money for us to become a self-sustaining enterprise. Similarly, if we stop buying coal, that still doesn't generate enough of a difference to make us self-sustaining. So the tariffs are a very important part to reflect reasonably incurred costs. We're not asking for a subsidy to cover our own inefficiencies, and NERSA has a methodology by which they adjust the tariffs to be reasonably cost reflective. I've referred to municipal debt, which is a key issue. We're negotiating coal costs, coal contracts. We are renegotiating fuel oil cost. In our last tenders that we put out, we were able to reduce the cost of fuel oil already by 20%, which I was very happy with, obviously, considering that it's a major expense item for us. We need to reduce our diesel consumption. The oil prices helped a bit on the cost front there. We've issued a voluntary severance program to our senior managers. We were able to exit about 182 of them from the organization. It's a very cost-effective intervention. You get a payback on a voluntary severance program of just over a year. So then you get your money back and the cost is out of the system forever. We are also looking at all of our expense items, including IPP costs, where we are working with DMRE. I spoke about procurement and SAP. Many of our procurement activities took place on a free text basis. So those of you familiar with SAP will know that if you want to save money through procurement, you have to stick to a catalogue of buying your equipment. And when I inquired what the percentage was of free text procurement, the number was really shockingly high. We are now reversing that and also implementing the necessary disciplines in our procurement system. We are trying to prevent abuse of procurement by rolling out something that is called price check, which checks on the internet when you buy something in order to ensure that we don't end up in a position where we are paying significantly over market rates for what we buy. And then lastly, also we are managing employee benefit costs, particularly overtime. Overtime is a big expense item for us, and that's something that I'm personally paying a lot of attention to manage better. On the balance sheet, we have had to cut our cloth, and that has led us to reduce our capex spend significantly. You can imagine that this has put a lot of pressure on the business, and therefore we've had to negotiate and also couple the capex spend to cash release from the business. So you can only spend what you unlock. So there's a lot more discipline there. We are being quite tight-fisted when it comes to releasing money. We're also doing capital scrubbing, making sure that we don't spend too much and that we don't gold plate what we build. We are trying to save on our provisions for decommissioning. You can imagine that the cost of decommissioning a power station that's been operating for a period of some 50 years is astronomical. But if we can extend the useful life of these assets, then what is a liability turns into an asset again. So this is not accounting jiggery-pokery. This is really changing the nature of the asset to leverage off the infrastructure that we have invested in. We're driving working capital quite hard, looking at spares inventory, and then also trying to create a new income stream through the just energy transition. So we've got a funding plan for our business. This funding plan is fairly well developed. We have already secured some 13 billion in funding for the current financial year, and we have uncommitted borrowings of about 17.8 billion. We have some space left over on the available government guarantees, but obviously as the fiscus comes under strain, we also have to play our part in relieving the strain on the fiscus, and that is part of the reason why we believe that by accessing preferential or discounted financing coupled to an accelerated decarbonisation of Eskom's electricity generation fleet is a great opportunity for us to reduce our cost of borrowing. Restructuring, we're making very good progress there. We've got the 3 divisional boards set up. We have relinked some 8,500 members of staff. Now, what relinking means, they were previously sitting in the head office. We've now put them back into the business, so the engineers are now back on the power stations where they again do proper engineering work, which we're delighted with. And we are making good progress on looking at some of our non-core assets. We are selling some businesses. We've got a very large property portfolio. It's not an ideal time to sell, obviously, but we are going to be approaching the market shortly with some property disposals that we want to exit from the business. We also want to look at public-private partnerships, and this links to the repurposing exercise. And then we finalized our operating model, which of course is very important in defining and clarifying what the final structure will look like. Lastly, people, an incredibly important part of the turnaround program. There are many hardworking, committed, loyal, professional, and highly skilled people working in Eskom. And it's an unfortunate narrative that's been perpetuated that Eskom is full of people who do nothing. And I must say that I'm delighted with the caliber of people that I've come across, really, really skilled individuals. And we want to energize them, we want to excite them, we want to give them a future that they can look forward to. And in that process, of course, we want to drive our corporate values. Corporate values, and you can imagine that integrity being one of those values. You will understand that the values didn't exactly receive a lot of prominence over the past decade or so. So as part of this value system that we want to re-energize, we are recovering money that was unlawfully paid. We've made some good progress against some well-known consulting firms. You will have heard that we are claiming 3.8 billion rand back from former employees whom we believe neglected their fiduciary obligations to Eskom, also some people that are currently resident in Dubai. We are communicating, I think, a lot more with the organization. The pandemic, unfortunately, has put a little bit of a damper on the visible felt leadership of visiting plants, but we do try and get out there and talk to the people. And then we've introduced some performance bonuses for lower level staff. Let me just immediately stop the rumor on social media. I don't qualify for any bonus. So this is not intended to line the pockets of executives. This is intended to motivate and engage people on the shop floor. We've implemented forced ranking for our top bands. This is a first for Eskom, and we will use that to distinguish better between performers and non-performers to drive a high performance culture. So let's just quickly look to conclude at the opportunity that climate change as a crisis presents for Eskom. We are a very large emitter, the largest in the country, of greenhouse gases, and we have a fleet of old power stations. So at the same time as we are able to decommission and replace these old polluting power stations with new low or no carbon assets, we're able to make use of the latest technology. And as you can see on the graph that we've put up here, the yellow line here is for the Sierra wind farm, which is an Eskom wind farm in the Western Cape. It's got a very modest capacity of only 100 megawatt, but you can see that on a levelized cost basis, at a relatively modest load factor, it beats just about every other generation technology hands down. And of course, these wind turbines and solar panels can be built in a far shorter space of time than the mega projects. You may know that mega projects are on average 75% delayed and 95% overspent. And this is not a South African issue. This is a global number. And we're of the view that the technology selection is really making itself, having regard to the fact that we are going to be putting into retirement between 8,000 to 12,000 megawatts of capacity over the next decade. So we need to rapidly start enabling the investment in new generation capacity by the private sector. And this is a very important strategic objective that we've got, and hence our corporate restructuring, and also hence the focus on the just energy transition, which intends to provide a future for those communities that have heavily invested in coal and are heavily dependent on coal. To just pull the plug on a town like Indrina, for example, will lead to an enormous social catastrophe, and we have to avoid that. And the way to avoid that, we believe, is to involve those communities in renewable energies. And this is the plan that we are now discussing with lenders, but also with our shareholder and also with Labour. And we are getting very good alignment across the board in implementing that vision. So we believe that we can, if we enable local manufacturing to supply renewable energy components, we can use this as an economic stimulus to reignite local manufacturing, create jobs, improve our emissions, obviously, but also increasingly what we find is that there are carbon tariffs imposed on exports, depending on the quantum of carbon that is used to manufacture a certain export. So you can imagine if some of our car manufacturers in South Africa were to be penalized because of the carbon footprint of the electricity that they use to manufacture the cars that they export, what that would do to the competitiveness of the industry. So this is a very important South African strategic issue that we believe offers a fantastic opportunity for us to act also as a post-COVID stimulus while making use of our natural assets, sun and wind. And of course, if you generate electricity, it's very difficult to compete. You cannot export coal and manufacture electricity in China and import the electricity back to South Africa. So generating electricity locally by means of your technology that you where you maximize local content really makes, I think, an enormous amount of economic sense. And we are engaging with a number of parties on this to enable this this transition to become a reality. So we're in a tough space at the moment. We understand the problem. The solutions aren't simple. They are challenging. We will not fix this overnight. Any aspiration that anyone has of a quick fix for Eskom, I think, is not grounded in reality. And we need to do a better story, I think, of explaining to people exactly how challenging this environment is. We are on track to implement the target set in the roadmap. We are divisionalizing. We are looking at ways of accelerating, in particular, the legal separation of our transmission business, precisely in order to enable us to attract private investors and generation capacity so that they don't feel that there's a risk of being prejudiced relative to Eskom generation capacity. So that's a very important step to enable all of the new investments to take place. And then lastly, we think that we are, in spite of all the difficulties that we've got, we are on the cusp of a major opportunity to take advantage of significant changes in the energy landscape that we can leverage to our benefit if we get policies aligned, if we get our act together as a country and attract the direct foreign investment that will enable this opportunity to become a reality. So with that, thank you very much. That concludes my presentation that I wanted to share with you. And I'm going to hand back to Nicky.
Thank you. Thank you. So to cover a few questions here, I think there's a lot. We've got exactly 48 questions that's already come in. Many of them obviously highlighting how disruptive load shedding is to small businesses, to any business, to businesses' ability to plan their activity and their operations going forward. So I hear what you're saying in terms of it being really a long journey that Eskom has in front of it, that it has a plan, and that it is moving in the right direction in order to address what has been an incredibly disruptive period for the South African economy as far as electricity supply is concerned. But if you had to put a point or an estimate of how long, can you give us a rough estimate even of how long South Africa as an economy, all of the businesses, all of our clients that are asking these questions, how long will we have to live with load shedding?
So I think there are two answers to that question. I think the first answer is that with the implementation of reliability maintenance, this deep maintenance program that we are implementing, we think that by August, September of next year, there will be a significantly reduced risk of load shedding because we will have done the midlife refurbishments that should have been done years ago already. So we will have caught up. Until that time, unfortunately, and this is the bad news, but let's rather put it out there, there is an increased risk of load shedding up until the end of August, September. We are planning and we are coordinating the maintenance program with demand forecasts in order to limit and minimize the risk of load shedding. So we are trying to be as responsible as we can be. It may be that we take slightly longer to do the maintenance in order to reduce the risk of load shedding, but those are the facts, and I think that we should not shy away from them. And I think we would be remiss if we did not share that. The second part of the answer to your question is that if we do not start the enablement of significant investments in additional generation capacity, we will, again, like in 1998, when the Eskom white paper was published, and when people were saying, you know, Eskom's got excess generation capacity, Eskom at the time said, please, let's build new capacity. And nothing was done, and the decision to build was left right up to the last moment. Now, what we are saying is, let's not have that deja vu sensation. Let's start enabling new generation capacity to be added soon. So DMRE are in fact doing this. They are in the process of issuing an RFP for some 2,000 megawatts of capacity to be added to the grid. So that's very welcome, and that's a very positive step. But we believe that there's more work to be done, particularly if you look at the decommissioning schedule as per IRP 19. So that's the short-term picture and also the medium-term picture.
Okay, so over the short term, to be clear, you are saying that between now and August, September next year, the risk of load shedding has actually increased.
That's correct, unfortunately.
Okay. And then another question we do get here is, there seems to be a lot of sort of confusion around Eskom's drive specifically towards greater use of renewable energy. And one of the questions that have been put here is, if you recall, in the State of the Nation address earlier this year, President Ramaphosa actually said that they will be buying electricity from independent generators that are open to actually promote the development of a generating capacity outside of Eskom. So one of the questions that come from Dudley here is, he's saying, is Eskom buying electricity from the wind farms and the solar private sector? And if they are, what percentage of their total production does that make up?
At this point in time, yes, we are buying. There is about 4,000 megawatts of installed capacity of renewable energy that we buy. This is so-called non-dispatchable electricity. Now, the difference is simply that you can pick when you want to burn coal, but you can't pick when the sun shines and when the wind blows. So renewable electricity is fed into the grid as and when the climatic conditions allow it. And one of the issues that I think people also need to get their heads around is that renewable technology, because of the fact that it's exposed to the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, to state the very obvious, that of that 4,000 megawatts, on a typical basis, we get about 1,000 to 1,200 megawatts fed into the grid. So there's a big difference between the installed capacity and the actual capacity that is being delivered. But we do buy at the moment. We'd like to buy more. And that is one of the key reasons why we are restructuring and legally separating out our transmission business to act as the buyer of electricity from hopefully many more of these IPPs.
Yeah. So one of the questions also asked here is, why can IPPs not operate as independent, setting their own prices and introducing some competition into the supply of electricity? So maybe you can just explain to us how the system works at the moment, and perhaps shed some light on that particular question.
So power purchase agreements are negotiated by the IPP office, which is a specialist unit that is set up inside the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. Eskom is the buyer of the electricity, so we are the off-taker of the electricity, but the commercial terms of the agreement are all negotiated by the IPP office. And the IPP office therefore sits down with the bidder and they negotiate. So the price that is determined is a price that has regard to the economic model that the investor has, the return that he seeks, the risk that he anticipates, the load factor that he anticipates, and in that sphere, the costs of electricity or the price of electricity is then negotiated. I think what has changed since the first couple of iterations of the renewable energy IPP program, where electricity prices that were agreed were quite high, and they were high for primarily two reasons. First of all, the regulatory environment was not well understood, and investors were risk averse, so they required compensation for that perceived risk. So that is now by and large resolved. So we understand what that is, and also the technology was not as well developed, and people weren't sure what they were able to extract in terms of load factors from the equipment that they were going to install. That uncertainty has also now been addressed. And we therefore think that we're able to see significant cost reductions now in subsequent bid rounds. My benchmark of the lowest priced electricity that I'm aware of that is not subsidized is in Abu Dhabi, where they've built a solar photovoltaic plant, and the price of electricity there, it's an EDF project, so it's a very credible investor. The price of electricity there is 1.35 American cents per kilowatt hour, which is really a very low number. And if an investor can earn a return on invested capital with that type of electricity price, that bodes very well for the price of IPPs in South Africa. So I think we'll be able to benefit from this technology revolution, but provided, of course, that DMRE issues the right inquiries into the market and that they negotiate hard to drive those prices down. Okay,
I think that provides some good background there and some nice little nuggets of information. From Chris Yelland here we have, has Eskom started the reliability maintenance yet? It was due to start the 1st of July 2020, but was then delayed. When is this actually starting? Now, Andre, I think you did address it in your presentation. Can you perhaps give us the day that you started on the reliability maintenance?
Yeah, so we have started on the scoping of the reliability maintenance program in February already. I got on board a very well-qualified engineer who's highly skilled in maintenance, and he started scoping immediately, visited all 11 power stations that were in scope for the reliability maintenance program. You'll understand that the cost of this program is somewhere in the order of 23 billion rand. So this is not something that you tackle lightly. He then designed his organization structure. We went through a recruitment process, and we've now got a fully staffed team that is now going into the power stations and starting to do the maintenance. So the program has already started.
So as we speak, it's begun.
It is being carried out, yes.
Okay. All right, so then from Cherie, she is saying, what is being done to ensure that municipalities pay their bill? If I do not pay my bill, I get cut off, ...
Yeah, that's a perennial question that we have to address. The municipalities, of course, are an intermediary. So we sell to the municipalities sell to consumers living in their municipal areas. Now, those consumers that do pay, in a number of court cases now, have been able to successfully interdict Eskom from cutting off electricity supply to a defaulting municipality. So For example, in two of our top defaulters, Maluti Apufong, which is Harry Smith, and Emalahleni, which is in the Vaal Triangle, Vereniging, we were interdicted from stopping supply to those municipalities. So what we've done is we are applying something that is called the nominated maximum demand. That is the peak electricity demand that a municipality can apply, and we do not supply more than that. Now, unfortunately, as you will have seen in the case of a town like Bethel, this causes significant hardship in the community. But Eskom also has an income statement and a balance sheet that it needs to look after. And if you do not apply the pressure to the defaulting municipality, nothing will happen. So we've taken quite strong steps against the defaulting municipality. Earlier in the year, we attached some of the assets of Imfuleni municipality. Imfuleni municipality, we took some of the movable assets through an execution order that was carried out by the sheriff of the court. That concentrated their mines, and they entered into negotiations for a payment agreement, which we will then make an order of the court. Similarly, we were able to attach a bank account in Maluti Apufong to the tune of some 224 million rand. We subsequently released about 90 million rand back to the municipality for them to pay salaries and also to carry out some COVID-19 related activities. But I think what we're trying to demonstrate is that we have a far more assertive approach to managing defaulting municipalities. After all, the president himself, the Minister of Finance, the Deputy Minister, the Deputy President have all said we need to have a culture of payment in South Africa. We can't supply services without paying for it, and I think that is needs to be accompanied. That exhortation needs to be accompanied by some measures that show the consequences of non-payment.
Okay, I think that answers that question, and we've got quite a few questions here around the topic of how is Eskom's restructuring actually, what is it actually going to look like? And what form will the restructuring unbundling take is one of the questions. Should generation not be sold while focusing on transmission and to a lesser extent distribution? Another question is what is going to happen to distribution? What about spare shortage on spares within Eskom? I'm not sure I understand that one fully. Indeed. Okay, yeah. So basically, a lot of those questions around what will this restructuring look like, and related to that, then of course, you know, the whole idea of will we have additional competition? Will it result in some price improvements for the South African public in terms of the cost of electricity, of course?
Right. That's a very rich topic. So the end state, as per the Department of Public Enterprises roadmap, is for 3 legally separated entities, wholly owned subsidiaries at this stage, under Eskom Holdings SOC, each with its own board, and that's why we've made progress on the divisionalization effort as a first step to road test this model of 3 separated entities. The reason why we want to retain them as subsidiaries at this point in time is that we want to avoid the duplication of cost, and our operating model is designed in such a way that it will enable us to still maintain one IT platform. We want to have one payroll, for example. We want to have certain corporate services that are still going to be rendered from a central head office environment in order to maximize economies of skill and scale. You can imagine if a new SAP system has to be put in place for each of the 3 new divisions, that will not only be a very time-consuming exercise, but also a very costly exercise. So the intention is then to have these 3 legally separate entities, with the emphasis being on transmission. We are looking at ways in which we can accelerate the legal separation. There are some regulatory hurdles in terms of the Electricity Regulation Act that we have to comply with. So it's not simply a matter of going to Cipro, buying a shelf company and changing its name to Eskom Transmission Pty Limited, and the job's done. We need licenses, we need to transfer assets, we need to transfer debt, we need to transfer employees, and all of this has to result in a structure that does not put our lenders in a position where they feel that their security is being imperiled, and therefore it's a complicated, challenging exercise. But I'm pushing my team very hard to accelerate that process as much as possible. The question around potentially selling generation, the question is, who would want to buy it? Who would want to buy an asset that is on average 38 years old, requires huge rehabilitation and decommissioning provisions to be applied, that requires about 60 billion rand of environmental capex? I'm not sure that we'd get much money for it, frankly. And that's just the harsh reality of doing some of the math on the back of a cigarette box. So we believe that the more favorable approach is for us to look at repurposing. So we've got power stations where we own significant acreage of land around those power stations, where we have rehabilitated open cast mines. This can be used to construct wind turbines or photovoltaic farms. We also have the opportunity to look at using the existing electricity evacuation infrastructure, potentially use the turbine halls to install gas turbines where gas is available and where we have close proximity to a gas transmission pipeline, so that we can reuse the infrastructure. I think that using those assets potentially as an equity contribution in kind to a public-private partnership would be a very elegant way of private sector involvement in a way that creates a future revenue stream for Eskom going forward. Just lastly, the issue of spares. I've walked the warehouses of a number of our power stations, and I'm not happy with what I'm seeing. We've got a lot of spares, but they're not always the right spares. And one of the exercises that we're busy with is to clean up all of the spares that we've got, to sell back to the OEMs, potentially to municipalities, some of the excess spares that we've got as part of our cash release program. We think that there could be about 2 billion rand that we can unlock from redundant spares that we don't need. So that is one of the key focus areas for us to improve the spares holding to a point where we've got the right spares and the right number of spares without getting too much working capital on our balance sheet.
Okay. We are probably running out of time, but I think there's a whole set of questions, probably about 10 of them. We're now up to 83 questions, so we haven't got near to asking all of them, and I apologize for that. But I think it's been a very useful session. It's been a very interesting discussion. I have one last question I'm going to try and squeeze in, even though we are running over time, because I think it is quite important. And they are a whole group of questions around Medupi and Kusile. But this one probably sums it up best. What are the total outputs of Medupi and Kusile, and how much have they been revised down versus the origin? That's one about Medupi and Kusile. The other one is asking, is it possible to recoup some of the cost that's been imposed on Eskom and therefore on South Africans as a result of the design flaws of Medupi and Kusile? So that's the second leg of this. And then from Dennis, there is a question asking, well, you know, if Medupi and Kusile are coming online, but their supply is unreliable, is it realistic for us to assume that that will ultimately improve the electricity availability factor? So if you could perhaps close us out with answering those three questions. There are many more around Medupi and Kusile, but perhaps that would address most of them broadly.
Right, so Medupi and Kusile are each designed, each unit is designed in the case of Medupi to deliver about 793 megawatts, Kusile slightly higher, about 812 megawatts. And due to various design defects, we have not been able to achieve that output. And that is why we have had to make the design modifications that I spoke about, which we've done successfully at Unit 3 and Unit 6 now, Unit 4 currently out. And we think that that will address the problem. These are big interventions. We've had to cut out per unit about 32 kilometers of boiler tubing. So that just gives you an idea of the scale of the intervention. This is not something that you do quickly or lightly. But once that is done, we think we will have units that can operate reliably at those levels for sustained periods of time. We are obviously in discussions, commercial and legal discussions with the designers of the boilers, and we have taken the decision, the approach that we will rather first go into ensuring that we are able to put the megawatts onto the grid, and then we will resolve the legal and commercial dispute. So we've agreed at this point in time that we will share the cost of making these changes 50-50 between ourselves and the contractor. And once that is complete, we will then resolve the legal dispute. But the urgency is now for us to get the electrons onto the wires, and that is why we are deferring the commercial discussions. But we will not let go of that liability. We've hopefully demonstrated that we're not afraid of the cause is just.
Unfortunately, we are, I think, now well and truly out of time, and there are still very many questions, and I hope that we will get the opportunity perhaps to send these questions through to Mr. De Ruyter and to Eskom, and hopefully we will get some answers for you. I think it's been a useful discussion. It certainly helped to set the scene for us, and we have gotten some timelines, some tangible timelines from this discussion. All of this, I think, is progress. All that is left for me to do is thank you, Andre, for spending this time with us and for answering the questions that have been posed during this period. And of course, I'd also like to thank you, all our clients, everybody from the media that have phoned in and spent this hour with us. We truly appreciate it. Thank you very much.